If you want to make a TV show for the BBC, you need to abide by a number of quite particular guidelines. One of them, for example, states that you must avoid giving undue prominence to any product or brand featured in your work. This means that whilst it might be okay for your script to mention, I don't know, Tunnock's caramel wafer biscuits where appropriate, it would be considered bad form if someone on your cast was eating one in every single scene. That really would be undue prominence. It's this very idea that prevented Time Commanders, a TV show which first aired in the early 2000s, from ever actually naming the video game it relied so heavily upon. More than that, its audience was never told, directly at least, that what they were watching was a video game in the first place. But that guideline from the BBC is only about half the story. The original creator of Time Commanders also had his own reasons for avoiding the idea that they were making a video games TV show. Can't believe I just air-quoted video games on this channel, solo point. Anyway, that reason starts off in here, a novel by Mark Twain called A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. It tells the story of a 19th century American engineer who, upon getting smacked around the head with a crowbar, wakes up in the world of King Arthur and his round table. Here he uses his knowledge of both history and modern technologies to fool the locals into believing he's some kind of all-powerful magician. Perhaps his greatest display of power is when he manages to predict an upcoming eclipse, claiming that he himself is the one responsible for blotting out the sun. After that, this quite ordinary man from Connecticut is treated like a god.
I have here, your majesty, a common, ordinary twig. Presto! Imagine what I could do with a tree.
This story had been the favourite of a man called Adam McDonald, who in 2003 had just landed a new role at Lion Television as part of their programme development team. This means it was his job to come up with new ideas for TV shows and then pitch them to places like the BBC when gaps in their schedule appeared. Well, it turns out a time slot had just come up for grabs, one that had previously belonged to one of the greatest TV shows of all time, Robot Wars. It's either that or Love Island for me, I think. Anyway, this gap in the schedule had McDonald thinking about that Mark Twain novel again and how a seemingly average person from the 21st century could go back into the past and just be seen as an actual wizard. Like, imagine the things that you could teach someone from the Middle Ages. There's loads of stuff. There's gravity, for a start. They don't really understand that back then. Idiots. And so as he's playing around with that idea, McDonald thinks to himself, what about the battles? History's full of those. Would we be any good at them? How would a taxi driver from Norwich fare against a general like Napoleon or Hannibal?
And as I remember it was actually in the shower one morning that I had this idea of, you took a group of amateurs back in time to refight a battle from history against the greatest military strategic minds, actually just being who they are and having watched telly and seen movies, kind of going back in time, you realise you knew as much as all the experts back there knew. Okay, so that's the start of an idea, but how do you turn that into a TV show that people would actually want to watch? McDonald's first thought was not video games, it was this. Well, not quite this, I couldn't find any miniatures. It was tabletop gaming. They were going to build the whole show around tabletop and then add some kind of CGI battles in post for the audience at home to watch. Now, there were two major problems with that approach. Number one, those CGI battles would either have had to be very crap or very expensive. And number two, the show's contestants wouldn't have been able to see them. Thankfully, when McDonald presented this idea to his colleagues at Lion TV, they came up with a more elegant solution. Rather than creating bespoke graphics from scratch, why not look for something that's already out there? Something we can use that we don't have to make. If only there was some kind of computer game or something, one that could render huge battlefields filled with hundreds of soldiers, which could then be commanded in real time by the player. If only there was something like that. It turns out there was such a game. In fact, there were two. One saw you taking on the role of a Japanese shogun, and the other a medieval king, but both promised total war.
It literally fell in our lap. Lion Television rang us up, and just they come up with the idea, and it just completely landed in our lap.
And so a meeting with the game's developers' creative assembly was arranged. As impressive as Medieval and Shogun are, they hadn't quite ticked all the boxes for McDonald and his team. In a perfect world, he tells the studio's founder, the game would look a little more realistic, and maybe you'd be able to get a bit closer to the action itself, so the show could point out a famous general giving orders from a vantage point, or fighting for his life in the midst of an ambush.
It's funny, as I was pitching him this kind of mad idea, you could see him kind of just catching eyes with all his developers. Then he went, let me show you something, and he took us into the back room where they were developing the Rome Total War, and I can't even remember whether he made us sign NDAs or not. I can't remember.
but you said, I'm going to trust you now. I'm going to show you something that nobody's ever seen. And he played us that, and we went, no, that's exactly what we had in mind.
Oh, wow, that's perfect.
So it's quite extraordinary, really.
As for Creative Assembly, well, they did not need too much convincing.
It would have been insanity not to do it. I mean, people pay fortunes to get that sort of opportunity on TV, but we got paid to do it. Not only did we not have to pay, we got paid to do it. It made us money to do that. I mean, it's insane.
So after getting the go-ahead from the BBC, Line Television is asked to create a pilot episode of Time Commanders to show that the format can indeed work. It's quickly realised that given the amount of time an episode of Time Commanders would have to fill, the show needed more than just a single contestant talking through their decisions. That's boring. Instead, Line decides they want a team of people working together, or at least trying to.
Welcome to the show that can put you into the heat of battle anywhere in history. Ready for action tonight is a team of ministers from the south of England, the Eagers family from Dorking, or a team of jiu-jitsu coaches from Essex.
It's decided that each episode should feature 4 contestants, with 2 of those sharing the role of general. They make all the high-level decisions in the battle and then pass on their orders to the other 2 players who act as their lieutenants. It's then their job to convey these orders to the Creative Assembly employees that are controlling the game. As you'd imagine, there's plenty of room there for miscommunication, and that really is the point, although not all of it was intentional.
There was one incident I remember where they had a group, they had sort of a line of guys in a phalanx all going diagonally sort of forwards, and I at that point found a bug in the game where if you tried to give units an order and they were grouped, and it would break, and so I had all these units just going all over the place, and I was trying as hard as I could to get them to do what they wanted, but it just kept on messing up,
Like herding cats.
and so I had to just sort of make up sort of role play and say, oh, the troops aren't listening to you.
Here's a nice bit of side trivia. The enemy forces in Time Commanders were not controlled by the computer, which is at least what I thought was happening. No, that was considered too risky. Instead, brilliantly behind the scenes, it was Tim Ansell, the founder of Creative Assembly, and Bob Smith, who had designed much of the game's AI, that were the ones actually pulling the strings. I'm told they sometimes went harder on the contestants depending on how much they liked them.
What they've actually agreed is that Caroline won't make the decisions. They'll leave all the decisions to the General Craig.
They didn't like Craig. Anyway, the pilot episode. It was filmed in one of the back offices at Line TV, and they didn't yet have access to Rome Total War because, well, Creative Assembly hadn't finished making it yet. But somehow things clicked into place almost immediately. The pilot centered around a conflict between the English and the French in the Middle Ages and was based upon a real historical battle of that period. And at some point during filming, one of the contestants decides to move their force up to the top of the hill to gain a better vantage point over the opposition, and suddenly one of the show's history experts who was there to provide commentary starts getting very, very excited. Apparently, this is what actually had happened in the battle itself. This was Mark Twain's novel realised. It was a normal person with no history or military background going back in time and somehow managing to match the thought process of the general they're meant to be imitating.
And so it was that kind of juxtaposition of some amateurs coming up with the same idea that a strategic general in history came up with, and an expert being aghast that they kind of did the same thing. And there was this magical kind of, literally a kind of 20-second sequence that got the show commissioned because it all came together in that one moment.
Alright, full disclosure, let me tell you what this video is actually about. So when I was a kid, I used to love Time Commanders. It got me into history, it got me into the Total War series, I watched it with my dad, I thought it was the bee's knees. And yet, somehow, unbelievably, it wasn't a runaway success, at least not by the BBC standards. The first season had 16 episodes, the second only got 8, and then they just sort of canned it. That was until 2 years ago when they brought it back for just 3 episodes. They even got Greg Wallace to host it.
Thank you. You're getting mullered in the middle there.
And of course I applied, easiest decision of my life, and yeah, I sat there full of hope, waiting like Scott Pilgrim in front of his front door, and eventually heard something. I got an email from one of the producers that said, we've received your application, and if we're interested, we'll let you know shortly. And then I didn't hear anything again, because I wasn't picked for season 3 of Time Commanders. But the thing I realise now, 2 years later, after self-indulgently putting together this episode on the history of a really quite niche TV show I watched when I was a kid, is that I would have been absolutely rubbish on that show. Because I'm not the Connecticut Yankee in the court of King Arthur. I'm not. I'm the one that asks to enable skirmish mode on my javelin throwers because I don't really want to micromanage them throughout the entirety of this battle. And that, nobody wants that. that wouldn't make for good television. When I look at the show, I see Total War, but when Adam McDonald looks at it, he sees at its core a show about ordinary people fighting their way through some of the greatest battles in history. For him, Total War was just a really smart way of demonstrating that. And that's why it's okay that I wasn't picked for season 3 of Time Commanders. Thanks for watching. God, I really did just go fully on brand there, didn't I? Sorry. Thank you to our sponsors, Eurogamer and The Loading Bar, and thank you to everyone that makes this channel possible via their support on Patreon. We've got some big news coming up, which we can't wait to share with you over there real soon, so look forward to that, and we will catch you next time. Goodbye.